today we're going to be talking about 10 things that can get your manuscript rejected. I'm going to shorten this title online, so if you're looking for the rest of the YouTube video, it's going to be much shorter because YouTube doesn't like long titles. I've discovered that after doing many long titles that they were like, ugh, gross, long titles. So, that being said, when you're submitting a manuscript or a short story, these also apply to short stories, the hardest part obviously is getting accepted. That's why a lot of agents, especially if you're doing an agented submission, will recommend that you start writing a second book or another set of short stories as soon as possible, because it can take up to years to get accepted, even if you don't do all of these things I'm about to say. Please do not do. And so it's not that your writing is bad, it's just that it's really hard trying to find the right publisher to take on your novel. As a result of that, I just wanted to give that as a caveat. You could be doing everything right and it could still take years to get published, and that is not your fault. It is just a hard industry to get into, honestly. But that being said, these are the top things that publishers look for. I did my own list from my own experience working in traditional publishing as an editor, as well as a list that I found compilated online, and I kind of spliced them together with the ones that I saw equally as common. This is not obviously an all-encompassing list, especially since certain publishing companies have like little things that bother them that don't bother other publishing companies. These are just overarching, this bothers pretty much anyone. So you probably want to avoid them. That being said, first one is plot holes. Now, a lot of people don't know what I mean when I say plot holes, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Example number one. The villain or main character has absolutely no motive for their actions. They're just doing it because I am the hero and I am the villain. No. That's an immediate, the publisher's going to be like, and slide it across the disc. And that's mainly because of the fact that we want our characters to feel three-dimensional. And so this creates a huge plot hole problem, because a lot of the times the motive for your characters doing things is the driving force of the story. So if their only motive is, I am this person, therefore I do this, you're gonna have a problem. Your editors are immediately going to be like, so why does the poor girl not take the money from the rich man? She would take the money. She's starving to death. Like, she would take the money, and yet they're like, no, she's just so virtuous. And I'm like, I don't care how virtuous you are. If a random rich man offers you money, you take that money. Like, if you're starving to death. Like, you need motives that are solid motives. And same thing with your villain. You can't just have your villain be like, I am evil because I am evil. Most of the time, that's not true. Yes, there are some true psychopaths out in the universe where they just are evil because that is their vibe, I guess, but they're very, very few. Almost non-existent. You generally want your villain to have an actual reason for doing what they're doing. Whether it's vengeance, whether it's love, whether it's they think they're genuinely doing the right thing, whether it's passion. There's a million different reasons, but just because I'm evil can't really be one of them. The next one that is another good example of plot holes is there's an obvious solution to the situation, but the characters don't do it, and there's no reason not for them to do it, and they never explain why they don't do it either.
Like children's cartoons.
Yes, like children's cartoons where you're like, okay, you can obviously get from point A to point B using the boat that you were just barely on, and they're like, huh, but for some reason the boat has mysteriously gone missing. Or like in those horror movies you see where they're like, they all have cell phones, but for some reason none of them use them.
And they never
explain why. Like if you say, oh, we're out of cell range, that makes more sense. But if you don't ever deliberately say that, then the readers the whole time are going to be like, call 911, why aren't you? Those are plot holes where the reader's just screaming at you in panic. Just, why? Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And then the last one is, well, actually not the last one, but I feel like it's the last one because it's the final straw, kind of. When characters show up purely for plot convenience for a big reveal that makes no sense.
Yeah, at least pay him a bunch of money.
You gotta make sure that there's a reason that this character is showing up. They're not just like, hello, I am showing up because secretly, I am your father, despite the fact that we never ever talked about the fact that you didn't know who your father was until just this second. And it's like, okay, wait, what? Big plot reveals can be great. I love a good big plot reveal, but it has to be properly foreshadowed. Now, funny story actually, I had this debate with my husband the other day about whether or not proper foreshadowing is needed. Proper foreshadowing is needed if you're not writing a genuine true crime story. Now, the reason I say that is because sometimes in true crime, some random person kills some other random person, and they did it because they wanted money in their pocket. It's not because they're vengeance or some crazy thing like that, right? It's not always because I needed vengeance. Sometimes it's just as simple as it was an accident. I pushed them into the coffee table and they banged their head and they died. Like, sometimes it's an accident. Like, sometimes there's not a motive. Sometimes that's in some ways scarier. But if you're going to do some sort of big plot reveal with a villain that no one expects, you have to have foreshadowing, so that way when you look back, you can kind of do the crime drama thing where they look back and they're like, oh my gosh, it makes perfect sense now. The enlightening moment. You have to have that lined up though. If you don't line up that foreshadowing, it's not going to feel as real, because funnily enough, we actually feel like it's more real if it makes sense than if it doesn't make sense. Readers are funny. We like our fiction to make sense, even if in reality sometimes it doesn't always make sense. We like our fiction to feel like comforting to us, even if reality isn't comforting and it's scary and terrifying. So that being said, don't have characters show up for plot convenience or a big plot reveal that makes no sense. And then of course the last one, Deus Ex Machina. I have a whole lesson on Deus Ex Machina on the AF Library YouTube channel. So if you have more questions on that, we can either do them at the end or you can watch that video. I highly recommend it. It goes over all the different problems with Deus Ex Machina and why it creates giant plot holes. Because, yeah, plot holes, like I said, those are part of the reason that it gets rejected so fast, is generally because, like I said, it doesn't feel real, but also because for a publisher, it is actually a lot of work to fix a plot hole. And unfortunately for you, publishers aren't looking for the best book, they're looking for the best book that is also the easiest to edit and produce and publish. It has to be both. If it's easy to produce and edit and publish, but it's also kind of boring, they're not going to do it. But if it's super good book, but it's not easy to produce and publish, they're also not going to do it. You have to hit that fine middle ground, which is difficult. That's why agents are nice, because then they can help sell the book for you. That being said, next one is character inconsistencies. Yes, so this is why I always tell you guys, if you might be aware of this, describe your characters and do the big four: eyes, hair color, skin color, and body shape within the first page. Because if you don't do it within the first page, the reader has already long since given a description in their brain of what they're going to look like, or they have a blob character. There's generally one of two readers. One reader can't imagine them without your description, and so they're just like this big jello blob that's moving around. Whereas there's another kind of reader that is like, I will just make up my own description, and then halfway through they're like, oh, they're African American, and I was imagining them as a redhead with pale skin. And it's like, yikes. So this is why it's important that within the first page you give some sort of description about those four markers, because then that way we as a reader or an editor are not feeling like, oh, this is going great, this is going good, or hey, I think they kind of look like a blob in that case. But for me, I generally give them a basic description, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, they're a dude, and I thought they were a lady this whole time. Like, that's another one. If you're doing first person, make the gender clear, please. Please, even if they're non-binary, make that also clear. If it's first person, make their gender clear. Do not make it so ambiguous that I'm like, halfway through the story, and I'm like, oh, so they're a dude. Oh, everything makes sense now. Yeah, that's not generally a good thing. It's not. You don't want the gender to be the big reveal. You generally want it to be pretty specific if they're non-binary, trans, queer. She, he. You want it to be clear.
Unless if that's what your story's about.
Unless the whole concept is the gender means nothing, and so you don't reveal the gender of anyone. And that case, it's
until the very last word.
Until the very last
It's
portion.
a masquerade party, and
Yes.
why?
This is fair. At that point, it's interesting. Interesting ideas. So, with character inconsistencies, once again, this is going to relate to plot holes because characters and plot should intertwine. If they don't, that's another problem. That's a whole other story. The character should follow the plot because they have the motive to, not because they have to. Not because you're like, I'm the author and you have to go to the left. And she's like a coward and she would never, ever, ever go to the left because the left has a giant freaking spider sitting there. And she's like, I'm going to go to the left. No! Absolutely not. This is why I think every writer should be a dungeon master at some point, just because of the fact that it helps you realize that you have no control over other people's motives. You can be like, hey, guess what? Here's this path and here's this path, and you're like 90% sure which one they're gonna choose, and then they're like, based on my character motive, and you're like, ah, crap, I forgot about that. You're picking a different path. So it's important. This is why it's important that you make sure that the plot and the character are intertwined and not separate, because if they're separate, you're gonna have a hard time. That being said, another one that is a character inconsistency that drives editors crazy / publishers that are accepting your manuscript is when the character is either uncharacteristically unemotional or uncharacteristically emotional for no reason. So for example, you have them be like very calm throughout this whole thing. Like, I don't know, maybe their ex-boyfriend got together with their best friend, and she's like, instead of being like understandably upset that she's like, the heck, you ditched me and then immediately got together with my friend, I'm upset. She's just like, oh, I'm so glad you two are so happy together. And then later someone steals her last slice of cake and she's like, that's my cake. And you're like, whoa,
Hey,
bud.
that's me though. I don't care about relationships. I care about cake.
Right, like I'm like, you can make it make sense, but at the same time, you have to make sure you've established why that makes sense. You have to establish that they don't care about relationships, but they care more about food. You have to establish that maybe that means more to them than the other. You have to make sure it's established. If you don't explain it, then the readers are just going, whoa, okay, what just happened? So you gotta make sure it's clear. If you're gonna do something like that, it has to be crystal clear to the readers, because if it's not, they're just going to think it's a character inconsistency, and they're going to be a little lost. Next one is the characters make choices that make no sense based on logic. So this is like the moment where, you know, there's a haunted house, and the character's like, you know what, why don't we spend the night there? And the coward is like, yeah, we totally should. And you're like, no, and not unless you pay me. I'm not staying the night in a haunted house. Now I understand if you're like, I don't believe in ghosts or something like that, going and staying the night in the haunted house, or like, I have to do it because my parents will give me $500 or something.
Exactly. $500.
I don't know.
Staying in a haunted house, I would definitely do that. You
Dude, I do it for 20.
Exactly, but see, you have to have some sort of reason. For me, I'm a total coward. So if someone said stay in a haunted house, I'd be like, you have to give me at least $500 before I'm gonna stay in that haunted house. But that's me, because I'm totally a coward. But see, that's the point. We're all different, and so you need to make sure that because we're all different, you establish that we're all different. So it's not they're all staying in the haunted house because they're all getting paid. It's so-and-so staying in the haunted house because they want to prove to their girlfriend that they're buff and manly. Or I'm trying to prove that I'm not a coward, or I'm trying to do it because I want money. You can have different motives, just make sure that they make sense. Yes?
I'm trying to maybe like the coward is going inside the haunted house because they're being chased by like
Yes, or they're being chased by someone. Yes. Exactly. And so you have to have a reason. They wouldn't just logically say, I will go in the haunted house, because even though all logic dictates that I will totally die. You need to have a reason. Yes, being chased in the house is another good reason. So, character inconsistencies, again, this is another one where it's just hard to edit. It's hard to edit because we don't know your characters as well as you do. So maybe what you did makes perfect sense in your brain, but you haven't fully explained it to us. We don't know that. And so as an editor, we'll just say, too difficult, slide. I don't personally say that because I'm a freelance editor now. But back when I was working for a traditional publishing company, didn't matter how much I begged, it was still a no if it was too difficult. Because unfortunately, that's just how the publishing industry works. They don't have enough time to sit and spend months and months editing your book. They have time to sit and spend a month editing your book and then move on to the next one. And so as a result of that, that's part of the reason why I love Monster Ivy. They're still my favorite people, but I'm going freelance because of the fact that I believe that everyone should have a chance to have an editor and to understand what is going on, because a lot of times you don't know. So, character inconsistencies are really hard to edit, so make sure that your character's motives and reasons for doing what they're doing are crystal clear to your reader. I would recommend, if you're doing traditional publishing, have beta readers. If you're doing independent publishing, have an actual editor. The reason I say that is because I've read way too many independently published books that only had beta readers that had massive plot holes. So, I don't care how good your beta readers are, they will miss things. Whereas, if you're doing traditional publishing, you probably don't want to have to pay for an editor because of the fact that they will do the editing for you, so long as it's clean enough. Hence why I say beta readers are good, because then it's clean enough, it's good enough. It's not perfect, but it's a little spiffed up, it's a little brushed up, you know, it's got at least the biggest problems over with most of the time. Again, it depends on your beta readers. That's another lesson though, finding good beta readers is hard. Alright, now this one may surprise you. Word length. This actually does matter. If you are doing traditional publishing, and even indie publishing, but it's far less problematic in indie because generally, as long as you're telling a good story that has been well edited, people don't really care. However, it does make a difference. It does actually. I can attest to that. Most of the time, it hits these word lengths. That's why they're given. For traditional publishing, when you're querying, you have to write your word length in your query letter. That's just part of it. When you put that word length in there, if it is too low for the genre you're doing, or too high for the genre you're doing, they won't even read it. They'll just toss the query letter right out. Now I know that hurts to say, but I'm just trying to be honest because it's important people know these things. The reason why is because, and I generally agree with this, but not always, like I'm actually currently editing a realistic fiction right now that is technically below the word count, but it is so beautifully written and I don't feel like we can really add much more. And so I feel like that's good. So this isn't always the case, but with traditional publishers, it does tend to be the case. They want a specific word count. Why? Because generally, if you have below the specific word length and word count for your novel, that generally means you're underwriting, which is, again, hard to edit, because we're basically going to have to say, okay, add this scene, 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 and it's just going to be a giant blob of highlighter yellow saying add this scene here. And then the worst part is then we have to wait for you guys to finish rewriting it and sending it back. And even though as a freelancer, I'm totally fine with that, traditional publishers ain't got time for that. And so if it's under the typical word length, over tends to be a little bit more acceptable. However, it depends on how much over.
1,000,005.
Definitely thrown in the trash. If it's 1,000,005 words over, it's definitely going in the trash. I'm sorry. That's what's called overwriting. This is when the plot goes boop, 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 and you go boop, boop, boop. Way too much lead up. Or maybe it's like this, and you go boop, 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 boop. Either way, some part of this is way too long and way misshapen and not appropriately measured out. And so as a result, with overwriting, Sometimes they can be okay with overwriting. Brandon Sanderson, but he is the exception to every rule.
Oh my gosh, Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah, and J.R.R. Tolkien, where he's like, published the whole 3-book series in one book, and they're like, sir? Yeah, so there are some people who are okay with that, but it's not very common. The only time it's okay, typically, is in the epic fantasy genre. That is the only time you can get away with overwriting because they expect overwriting. However,
because J.R.R. Tolkien exists and Brandon
Sanderson exists,
and they've just been
yeah.
bullied. I'm like, whatever. I
Move on.
don't care. Just publish it.
Exactly. And so as a result of that, it makes it so that they're just like, whatever, epic fantasy is just long, it's meant to be long. People like these for some reason. No, I like them too. They are good. I just have to tease about it. That being said, with that, you typically don't want to go too high over the word count. If you want to know more about word lengths, I do an Adult Writers Club video all about word counts, and I tell you all the different word counts for all the different genres, what is over and what is under. And that way you know typically what your goal is. And again, you can go over or under that goal, but I would recommend coming close. Generally, I would say it's within 5,000 words. Most of you are probably writing YA of some flavor. Am I wrong? Young adult genre of some flavor?
I'm still debating.
I'm still debating. I feel like it's YA just because your characters are YA age, but it could be older junior for yours specifically.
One of the ones I'm writing might be adult. I
Yeah.
have problems.
So it's like, there you go. See, that's why you need to know your typical word count, because young adult is 50,000 words. However, new adult, which is a newer genre, adult tend to be more like 55,000 words and things like that. And again, it's within about 5,000 words. That is your good range, but it doesn't have to be. The one, like I said, the one that I'm doing right now that's an independently publishing book. We can't add much more, and it's beautiful as it is, and it's about 40,000 words. It's about 10 below what it should be, but who cares what it should be? It's a good written story. Like, it feels good. And so sometimes you can get accepted being under or over. I just will say, more than likely, especially if you're going to a big publishing house, that's going to be a problem. If you're going to a smaller publishing house, you're probably going to be okay. They'll probably at least read it. Whereas if you're doing anything like Penguin Random House, Shadow Mountain, more than likely if you're under or over. Unfortunately, again, this is why I went out of the traditional market, because as much as I loved Monster IV in the traditional market, I also didn't like a lot of the things they were doing, because I think that writers deserve better. But then again, I'm also a writer, so I might be a little biased. Because I too have been rejected for random reasons like this. So, that being said, next one is too many. And when I say too many, I mean too many characters, too many magic spells to memorize, too many places to memorize. In general, if you have enough places, characters, magic spells, fill in the blank, that I have to pull out a spreadsheet to keep track of them, you've officially gone too far, unless you're in the epic fantasy genre, in which case you can get away with that. But that is only epic fantasy. That is strictly the thing. Yes?
So, what if you were making a series and, like, a fantasy series?
Throughout the series is totally acceptable. It's when it's in the first book.
Okay.
So, within the first book, so for example, Percy Jackson, they had Annabeth, Grover, and Percy, right? That was your main characters. That was it. Then he branched out with each book. And then same thing with Harry Potter. You have Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Then she slowly branched out with each novel that she got and slowly grew the cast, right?
The spell list.
And the spell list, exactly. But she slowly grew it. The point is, if you grow it throughout the series, that is perfectly acceptable. However, if you're dumping 280 spells in the first 5 chapters...
Ow. My brain.
Exactly. The editor's going to go
Like,
and
I
put it
have
down.
a decent memory, but my brain.
Exactly. Or if you're introducing 7 characters in the first 2 paragraphs, again...
Ow.
How? That's my
People do it.
question.
People do it. It's genuinely a problem that writers have. And I'll be honest, I actually had a few of these where when I was part of Monster IV, I was like, okay, I love the concept, but you're hurting my brain. And so we had to be like, I'm sorry, but No. Because
It's like,
when you,
ow, my brain, it's in pain. I love you, but no.
I love you, but also please don't give me a migraine. Yes. So this is just one where it's too many of any good thing is a bad thing. Treat everything like it's a spice. And some spices you want more, some spices you want less, right? But that doesn't mean that every single spice you're going to give a cup of spice. Too much. You don't want a cup of garlic in your tiny little bowl of mac and cheese, right? That's way too much. However, if you do a little garlic in your pasta sauce, that's great. Like, exactly. Or if you want to do a cup of garlic in like a massive casserole dish, that's also great. But doing like 1 cup to 1 cup ratio,
That's
not
like
much.
half garlic.
Exactly.
Just eat a loaf.
At that point, just eat the bulb. Yeah, exactly. So that's pretty much how I do this. Is that there are spices that you might love, but that doesn't mean that everyone else wants 1.5 million of them. So take that into account. If you love stories that have 1 million characters, introduce them slowly. If you love stories that have 1 million spells, use them slowly. Just in general.
And make sure you keep track of them yourself.
Yes, and make sure you give yourself a spreadsheet if you're doing something like that, because
It's like, oh, I forgot what this one did. I forgot, like,
exactly.
Just have a separate document listing all your characters and like what they're known
well,
for.
I have that. Really? Yes. Well,
Okay, so this one is kind of like side
good
B.
job, man.
Side B to the too much is because of the characters. Generally, this happens when you have too many characters, so this is kind of like a point B. Sliding viewpoint. This is not when you say, this is Alice's viewpoint. This is James's viewpoint. Like, you make it very distinct. This is when halfway through the paragraph it becomes James's viewpoint. And you're like, what is happening?
It's like 3 stars.
Exactly. At least do the 3 stars. At least do a paragraph break, something to indicate that there is a
Something.
change.
Please.
And do not do first-person sliding point of view. I'm sorry. I've seen this far too many times where people will do first-person novel and then they'll do first-person for everyone else and they won't fully indicate it. And so by the time I'm done reading the paragraph, I'm like, oh, that was a different person. Got it. Yeah, that's... Generally with first person, don't do alternating points of views. Only do alternating points of views if you're doing third person, please. It can be pulled off, but it's really difficult. And Angela, you seem to have an inquiry or a comment.
Oh, I was just saying that's what happened in the run.
Yes.
Like we would just switch through all 10 characters randomly.
Yes, I'll be honest, that was the one thing that bothered me, but I think that she was able to get away with it because of the fact that that sliding viewpoint thing hadn't really been invented as much or done as much. Most people just picked a singular character and she was like, I'm going to have a cast, and they were like, I don't know what to do with your cast. So I agree. There are some older novels that don't follow these rules. In general, if it was published before the 2000s, does not count. Probably won't follow these rules, and that's probably because they're still figuring it out. And so that's why it's bad. Not to say that they're bad authors. They were good authors. They just didn't have an editor who knew what to do with what they did. Because they were new, and they were like, let's do a new thing. And the editor's like, I don't know what to do with your new thing. So, make sure that if you're doing a sliding viewpoint and you're changing viewpoints, you don't slide into the viewpoint. It's a direct. I would definitely say do the 3 asterisks, especially if you're traditionally publishing, because then it gives the editor the option to, when they format it, do fancy little things. Like if you're doing a royalty thing, they can do little crowns and things like that, you know. Then they can put fancy new things in there. So don't do something fancy like hearts or anything. Just do asterisks. That way when they format it, they can make it extra look cool. Exactly, but see, then you can suggest that and say, by the way, for the page breaks, I would suggest Celtic knots, but you don't. The one bad thing about traditional publishing is sometimes they just do whatever they want and don't really consult you, which is why a lot of people are going indie nowadays.
And also it's, cheaper.
Funny.
Well, not cheaper, but easier to get accepted into.
Yes, yeah, I was gonna say, hold on there. I as a person who's helped lots of indie things, yes. As a person who has helped lots of indie authors, indie is way more expensive. However, it is you don't have to go through the same process because pretty much you just get to publish it on Amazon. The only problem is if you want to be of any success, you have to pay for an editor, you have to pay for a formatter, you have to pay for a cover design. Yes, you do have to pay for these things. If you do not pay for these things, it is much harder to market your book. Anyway, just the little throat clearing because I've had one too many people who are like, yeah, I don't need an editor, and then I read their novel and I'm like, you really did need an editor. So that's the one problem.
I don't need an editor. Grammar mistake. Ow, that grammar.
Giant plot hole. Yeah, no. So with independent publishing, just as a quick side note, because I like side notes. That's why I do an hour-long class here, is because we do a lot of random side notes. With independent publishing, I actually have a whole video on talking about independent versus traditional in the Adult Writers Club videos. So please look at that because it talks all about the ups and downs of both. And let me tell you right now, independent might be more expensive, but you are going to have entirely your choice. That is the one benefit. It's entirely your choice. But unfortunately, that also means it's entirely up to you to market. It's entirely up to you how much money you want to spend on your cover. And yes, people do judge books by their cover. I'm sorry, it's just a universal truth of life.
They told us not to.
I know. They always tell us not to, but people still do. Especially even just subliminally, like subliminal messaging. With designing your cover, exactly.
Bought.
Yes, they get your book bought, and not only that, but it means
how I pick which book I'm going to read next.
Exactly, and if it's similar to other things, then they're more likely to pick it up. For example, if you're publishing, I don't know, some sort of romance novel, it's probably going to look a certain way, right? And if it doesn't look that certain way, people are automatically going to look at it and go, I don't know what genre that is, and move on. However, if it looks the way a romance cover is supposed to look, then they're going to go, ah, yes, I know this one, and they're going to pick it up. Yes?
I worked as like a media aide,
Mhm.
so we were like going through our shelves,
Yeah.
straightening them, and
Yeah.
nobody's really checking them out. So then we put like 2 or 3
Yeah.
covers showing, and then immediately those ones just went crazy.
Yep. It's true. Honestly, covers really sell your book. And you gotta make sure it's an in-date cover. I actually just learned this recently at one of the writing conferences we did where I was helping host. And she was like, guess what, as an indie author, the thing that helped me sell my book was making sure it was in-date because she'd had a cover that she really loved, but it was about 10 years out of date. And unfortunately, if it looks 10 years out of date, people are gonna assume it's 10 years old. And so they don't buy it. Whereas if it looks modernized, it fits the current genre theme, they're more likely to pick it up, which I found fascinating.
You mean
So-
trends?
Yeah.
Yes, you actually have to hit trends. I know. Sobs in corner. Anyway, so yes,
What do you do the cover
that's
last?
that's part of the reason why if you're going indie, it's hard because you want your book cover to look a certain way, but you actually do have to follow trends in order to get things sold. And
That's like the stereotypical popular girl.
I know, but you have to if
Can
you
I
want it
punch
to
a
actually
wall?
sell.
Not
like,
here.
Not
how
these
about
walls.
Mary?
You can
That's
punch that
funny.
door if you wish, because that's hardy enough it might not die.
Oh, man, but without her, my
I know,
knuckles.
I'm
you're
sorry,
already
but then you
reading.
damage
You
our
gotta be
wall,
careful
and then
with
I'd
that.
have to make your parents pay for it, and I don't want to do that. So, I know, I get it, trust me. As a person who is making these YouTube videos, and every YouTube video that I follow the trends on does better, I
How
get
much
it.
do you like to walk in the room?
So, moving on.
Gosh darn it.
Speaking of tropes and trends, following a certain trend or trope or a theme is not bad. However, the problem comes when you're following it so hard that that's all your book is about. So, doing that little trope is okay. Like, for example, the classic romance Christmas trope. Lots of people love that. I'm not as a
So
huge fan of that,
Hallmark.
but some people love Hallmark. Lots of people do. I love some Hallmark movies and don't like others, so it depends. But it depends.
got some good
They've got
ones.
some good ones, exactly. But the thing about it is that
I like
with
the ones with plot and character development. Some of them don't have that.
exactly,
Most of them
exactly.
don't have that.
So with tropes and themes and trends, the problem is that if you're trying to hit a trend, A, you have to write your book super fast. Because trends come and go like these. Bye. Yep, that pretty much fit, actually. They're just gone. Thank you. So, pretend it. Be nice. So,
Yeah, it'll be nice.
so, that being said, trends and tropes and themes are nice because they're generally universal. You know, the chosen one. That's never going to go out of style. That's just a thing. Some people don't like it, but that doesn't mean that it's not a thing.
It's kind of like cliche, but like there's some spins you could still use with that.
Exactly.
So
You can still do some spins. And then themes, like for example being anti-bullying, that's perfectly acceptable. But if you're pushing the theme so hard that the character's basically just sitting there to be bullied so you can do an anti-bullying theme,
ow.
No, that's painful.
that's painful.
that's
You
not
have to
a
actually,
book.
you need, yes, it's not a book. You need an actual character development. You need an actual plot. You can't just have them sit there and be
Are
punched in the face
people.
repeatedly.
Make them people.
Exactly. Make them people. Don't just make them a cardboard cutout that you abuse. Yes. So that being said, following tropes and trends and things like that can be beneficial. Yes, they can. Themes are also good. Having a theme in literature is really positive. But the problem is when you follow it so hardcore that that's the only thing your book is about. You want to make sure that it has an actual plot and an actual character development, and that your tropes, trends, and themes come as like point F in your PowerPoint of making what this book's about. You don't want to make it point A. All right, next thing is, this one might seem obvious, but we're going to talk about how to avoid this thing, so too boring. Again, this might seem obvious. Generally, if the book is boring, people put it down so they don't want to sell it. Imagine that. But what I mean by this is that a lot of publishers, and I actually always felt this way, but I didn't know if other people agreed. I spent all night last night kind of like researching different stuff for this lesson, and pretty much every single publisher had this thing to say. With being too boring, if the action and or drama doesn't start on page 1, you have lost the interest of the publisher. They're gone. They don't care. They need action and drama on page 1. That's because readers need that too. And publishers are just a reader who help you get published. So, the ultimate thing you can do is start drama and action on page 1. And when I say drama and action, I don't necessarily mean it has to be the climax of, you left me, ah! It doesn't have to be that. But it has to have something that makes us want to keep reading. And by drama and action, it can be subtle drama and subtle action, but it has to make us feel a connection to the character. So for example, I had a writer who I highly recommend her novel. It is fantastic. But the first time I read her thing, I was like, oh boy. She had a prologue. And let me tell you right now, publishers will read your prologue. 50% of readers don't read prologues. You have to have your first chapter be just as interesting as your prologue. Because if your prologue's super interesting and your first chapter is not, and they skip that prologue, like 50% of readers do, they're going to get bored. So you got to have both of them be equally on par with being interesting. It's just unfortunately a fact of life. I don't know why people skip prologues. They're there for a reason. But some people believe that they're superfluous to requirement. Sad. Anyway, so that being said, with drama and action, you don't have to do it very intensely. Like for example, with this girl, she was doing like the main character's packing her boxes. It's called Meeting Twilight. I highly recommend it if you like magic and mystery. She's packing her boxes and they're moving again and everything, and like that's not terribly interesting. But what made it interesting was about 5 lines in, I found this golden line that I was like, oh yes, this makes me like her. This makes me want to keep reading about her, because she basically is staring at the walls and she's like, well, I guess the one benefit of moving, as many times as I have is that I don't have to stare at these mustard yellow walls anymore. I really hate them. And so it adds kind of a little drama because the character's being like, well, I hate moving, but I hate those walls more. And so that was kind of gold there. I was like, yes, I like this. I can relate to her. Exactly. I'm like, I feel this. I like this. And so it makes me like her. It makes me feel like I want to keep reading. And I will say this tends to happen pretty much every indie author that I've ever edited for. Their best first line is about a paragraph in. I don't know why. It's just a general rule. And I think it's because writers need to warm up. they need to warm up, they need to work a little bit before they find that golden line. And then you just take that golden line and you just rearrange or delete, depending on if it's really boring stuff that you started with, but it depends. So that being said though, it made it seem a little dramatic, right? It made it seem off the bat that I'm like, okay, I can relate to this, like, and then why is she moving? And she's like, we moved so many times, and you're like, okay, is her family in the military? Like, what's going on here? It gives you a little bit of intrigue, a tiny little bit that makes you kind of be like, huh, I want a little more. You know, you're showing rather than telling, instead of just being like, and she's moving because blah 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 blah. You're giving us little intrigue, so the reader's like, I want to keep reading so I can figure out what is happening here. So, again, drama and action doesn't have to be like in the middle of a car chase or in the middle of a dramatic unrequited love scene. It doesn't have to be that. It can be that if you want it to be, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be just small little dramas, little life dramas that make us go, man, I feel that. I vibe with you, you know? And if you vibe with the character, you're generally more likely to wait a little longer for the drama and the intrigue and the action to start. So having a little character drama in the beginning can definitely help spice things up. Or even just basic action, like she's about to crash her bike or something like that. That's an action that is dramatic, whereas maybe if you just had her riding her bike with her friends, that's slightly less dramatic. So it doesn't quite give us the same amount of tension feeling. All right. So this one actually happened a lot at Monster Ivy. So let me see. I'm going to shorten this, but basically, they don't sell your genre. You don't want to submit a murder mystery to a place that does cutesy romances. It's just not going to happen. They're immediately going to read it and go, you know. This happened a lot with Monster Ivy, but when I was working there, because of the fact that they're a lot more gothic, scary, creepy. And so we get a lot of people who are like, well, it's kind of creepy YA, and we're like, no, we want creepy YA, not like kind of spooky. Like we want actual creep factor. And so with that being said, you need to make sure they sell your genre and that it is something that when you read other books that they have published, it fits. So for example, if you are writing a book that is an awful lot like Fablehaven, that being said, Shadow Mountain is really hard to get into. If you're reading a book like Fablehaven or something like that, and you're like, my book it has a lot of same vibe. Not same concept, but same vibe. Then you're going to be like, hey, they sell my genre, I think I could get published with them. Whereas if you're like reading a horror novel and you're like, I think they have the same vibe as my realistic fiction cutesy romance, I think you're off. Probably
check
you're going to
those
publish
vibes.
there. Yeah, you might want to check those vibes. I think something's
Either
wrong.
that or I think something's wrong with that romance novel.
Exactly, something's very wrong. Yes. Gwen seemed to be motioning, so I was not sure if she had a comment.
What's your definition of vibe then?
Okay, so basically what I mean is that if you break it down to its most essential plot points, like what I'd call the tropes of the novel, it fits most of those tropes of the novel.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
So like for example, Harry Potter and Percy Jackson both fall under the category of semi-chosen one. Right? Ultimately, when you think about it long enough, they're ultimately both chosen ones. They ultimately both have magic in them, whether it's godly or regular. They ultimately both kind of like, it's core elements, the most basic things that you're like, I don't want to admit that this is technically the vibe of my book because it's not what it is, because it's not. A book is so much more than that. But if it doesn't hit those points that are the same points as the publisher, then they're not going to want to publish it because they have a certain market. They have their own, believe it or not, publishers have their own niche market. And if you don't fit within that own niche market, they aren't going to publish you. Because they need to market the books that they are marketing. They're giving a promise to their readers saying, if you see our insignia on it, it will have X, Y, and Z content. For example, when you go out there, I can't remember the name of the publishing house, but there are a lot of publishers that do, those romance novels. I'll just say those in italics. And you generally look at the front cover and you look at that publishing insignia and you know it's going to be one of those romance novels, you know? And it's the same thing with other publishing companies. If you look at a book that is published by Shadow Mountain, and it is and it is young adult. What do you automatically think of? Fablehaven, Candy Shop Wars, Beyonders. They do a lot more than that, but that's like their main person. So as a result, if it fits that kind of vibe, you're definitely gonna want to try and publish there. Whereas if it's a little bit more like creepy, spooky, scary, you might want to go with Monster Ivy. And so it's just about making sure that the books that they are publishing also fit with the book you're trying to publish, and that they have a similar undertones. When you look at the basic core heart details of your novel, what are the cores? I'd say pick 5, and then pick 5 from each publishing company that you think are their cores, and then make sure you hit all 5, or at least 4. 4 is the absolute minimum. If you do any less than that, they're probably going to reject you just because you don't fit their niche. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. And now I have to wrap this up real quick because I've been talking so much. All right. So I know this one. I know. This is harping, beating the dead horse. But show don't tell. Now the reason I say show don't tell is because of the fact that it tends to get boring when you tell. It tends to feel very factual and kind of like, I did X, Y, and Z, therefore, moving on. Facts. It feels a little bit like a textbook. Or you can do the opposite, where you're trying so hard not to tell, but you don't know how to not tell, that you're like doing poetic, flowery things that are too fancy. See, now when I say too fancy, there's a certain line. I actually did research on what is considered too fancy. Because I am a very much poetic writing person, so I was like, I'm curious, what is considered too fancy? So, too fancy is not. Tears welled up in her eyes as she gripped the photo album to her chest, her heart pounding in her chest with just pure rage and at the universe. You know, that's not too flowery. When it gets too flowery is tears welled down her eyes like the droplets of moon petals in the season of Samaria. That too much. Officially too much.
Black leather of the photo album. So many dear memories, like
the black leather of the photo album, the exact color of the nightmare stallion of. It's like too much. Officially too much. You want detail, but you don't want so much detail. Your readers are going, pardon? What did I just read?
Are you gonna pay per word here?
Are you gonna pay
Are you high?
Are you high? Yeah, you don't want your readers asking that question. So, that being said, when you're using poetic flowery language, it's okay. Again, it's like a spice. You use it sparingly. You don't constantly do loads and loads and loads of poetic flowery language, but if you want to have one flowery line in there, perfectly acceptable. Just don't make sure it's every line. Make sure you don't do every line. Yes?
And sometimes flowery lines can be a good thing. Like
Yes, exactly.
Characters really deep thoughts.
Yes.
Or like adding just a little bit more detail than you usually do can be a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Like, you just, like you said, you don't want to overkill it, or
Yes.
else people are gonna look at it and be like, I didn't even understand half of that.
Exactly. You want to use it like a spice. Some spots you use more, some spots you use less, but you don't want to use it all the time in everything. Yes, exactly. And on top of that, showing not telling is generally better because it helps us feel the character's emotions better. Generally, if you're showing us how they feel, then we start to be like, I feel that. Whereas if you're telling us they are sad, we don't really feel that. We're just kind of like, okay, they're sad. And why should I care? Whereas if you're telling us that they're gripping this photo album and they're sobbing their eyes out, you're kind of like, oh, well, something's wrong. You feel that a lot more. It's a lot more intense. All right, next one. Pacing. This one is so freaking important. All right, so the pacing of your novel. Now, what do I say when I say pacing? This goes back to kind of the overwriting and underwriting thing. This relates to it because generally if you're an underwriter, your pacing is too fast. If you're an overwriter, your pacing is too slow. So it relates, but not quite the same. The reason why is because sometimes you can write the perfect amount of words and the pacing is still off. It's just generally a good indicator. So, that being said, with pacing, You want to make sure that your ratios are right. You want to make sure that your intro getting up to the exposition is pretty short. You can have it a little longer, but if you wait more than, I would say,
1,005 pages.
again, I don't understand this obsession. So, I would say,
Michael, it's either go big or go home.
valid. So,
And it's
with-
at the next level.
I would say if you hit chapter 15 and you still haven't reached this exposition point,
Ow.
you've gone too long. You've gone way too long.
Why would someone do that?
I don't know, but there are people who do that. However, if your exposition point is like even shorter, I've seen exposition points that are literally this short. And I'm like, whoa, okay, I need more
Chapter
introduction
2.
than that. Exactly, chapter 2, we're fighting and dying in a war. Whoa. For a short story, that's more acceptable because the pacing needs to be faster. But with a chapter book, a typical novel, you're not gonna want to be like, and now our whole lives are at stake. Page 2. Like, no, too fast. You don't want this. You also don't want this, though. You want to make sure that it's somewhere in between. Then with this, you're going to want to make sure it's a good amount of your book. Most of your book is going to be the lead up, because if you have yay much lead up, oh boy, this is problems. However, if you also have this much lead up, by the time you get there, they're bored. So, you want to make sure you have just the right amount of lead up. Generally, I would say, I actually heard a good rule for redemption character arcs the other day that actually fits very well with pacing of plots as well. So, for those of you who know Zuko, moving on. Yes, Taylor Rivera did a fantastic presentation, and one of the things was character redemption and talking about Zuko's character arc. And with his character arc, you notice that it takes 2 seasons for him to redeem what it took 1 season to create. Right? It's the same thing with plotting. If you have yay much of the introduction, you want to have double as much of the incline. Because it's going to take that much more work to get you to the climax. You can't just yeet yourself to the climax immediately, but you also can't be like, stairs like Po and Kung Fu Panda. Too much. If your readers are going, stairs, you know it's officially too much. So, you want it to be about double. So, I tried to do it about double. You want it to be about double as long. Then, with the climax, you want to make sure you don't drag it out too much, because then you still need time to fall down a little bit and then give the denouement. You don't want to fall down too much, because if you give them too much resolution, then the readers are like, why am I still reading? They've resolved it, moving on. Like, you want it to just be like, oh, like if this is like introduction and then rising to the war, and then there's this war and this conflict, and then it's like the war's over. Like, chill. That's a basic example. Generally, this is what war is generally a series plot point, just so you know. But just if that is your plot, you want to make sure that your pacing is about like this. Very nice, even looking. You don't want any part to be too long or too short, because then basically, if you can draw out your plot and it looks like this, you're probably okay. If you're drawing out your plot points and it's looking like this or like this, then you're probably off in your pacing somewhere. I would say it's a good idea to write it out like this. I would also say the 7-point structure is another one that's really great. 7-point plot structure. If you can hit all those 7 points and you're not like at any point being like, there's 7 plot points I'm trying to fit in this one space, that's an indicator of a problem. Yes.
So there's this author that I've read before called Jenny James.
I've heard of her.
She, I don't mean to insult her.
No,
she
yeah.
likes to kind of rush through her endings.
Some people do.
And,
Absolutely.
for some people that's good, but
Yeah.
for I feel like most people it's
Yes.
a little better to just have that good slowish
Yeah, no, I agree.
journey back down, because it's
Mhm.
like they want to feel as though they got their good story ending.
Exactly. You want to feel that it's resolved. It's not just like, it's not just the classic Disney Cinderella, they kiss, mwah, the end.
Or Hallmark.
or Hallmark, they kiss, mwah, the end. A lot of romances tend to do that. I'm guessing it's romance.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of romances tend to have rushed endings, and I think that's why people, gravitated so long towards Jane Austen, because she almost did the opposite, where it's too long of a denouement. And so I think there's a balance. You don't want it to be too long, where you're like, okay, we're doing the 25 years later epilogue, but you also don't want it to be so short that you're like, but I just got to the happily ever after, and now they're running out the door and leaving me. I agree completely. It can work for you. I'm not saying that you have to do these things. I'm just saying that generally, if publishers see these things, they notice a problem. Unless it's romance, in which case there's a lot of things you can get away with. Or epic fantasy. There's a lot of genre-specific things. If you have a rushed ending in your romance, you're probably going to be okay. Unfortunately. I know it makes me sad. Or if you have a super long build-up and it's epic fantasy, again, you're probably okay. There are certain genre niches that fit well for your thing. We can talk more about genre niches. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes.
I just realized you sort of covered this.
Yes. No worries. It's okay. We can recover it.
I'm still reading that series by Brandon Sanderson.
Yes, Brandon Sanderson.
And there's like a ton of problems,
Mhm.
and they're in the middle of a war.
Yes.
And the war ends, and then
Yes.
they end up in war against the whole world.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And then, like there's space between
Mhm.
the two wars, and then
Yes.
they forget about these other problems that they have to solve because it takes so long for them to get back on that I don't even
Mhm.
remember that there are problems in the first place.
Yes.
And I'm like, wait.
That tends to happen a lot in epic fantasy. Yes, epic fantasy is very common to have that happen. So unfortunately, that is just a epic fantasy specific problem. So again, we have the romance specific problems and the epic fantasy specific problems, where publishers let you get away with some of that stuff because it's typical for the genre, even if it's not necessarily the best. Does that make sense? Cool. So that being said, if you have a specific genre that you're worried about, like, what are my problems? Come talk to me. I can probably tell you what your most common problems are. All right. The last one is avoid the use of cliches. Now, what do I say when I say cliches? Funnily enough, cliche actually gets misdefined a lot of the time. Cliche is not actually trope. Trope and cliche are very different things. Trope is when it's an overarching scene or plot thing. Cliche is a line-specific thing. So, for example, butterflies in my stomach. That is a cliche. However, having the romance in Christmas time is a trope, not a cliche. So, it's funny because a lot of people use those interchangeably, and technically, if you use them interchangeably, people will know what you're talking about, but that doesn't mean it's correct. That being said, with cliches, it's mainly just, again, it's like a spice. Thank you for coming. You use it sparingly. You don't want to dump cliches in your whole thing and say, butterflies in my stomach, and, oh man, throw out some more. I know there's more, but that was the main one that came into my head.
His touch makes like shivers or
Yes.
goosebumps run down my
Goosebumps
spine.
run down my spine,
Light
and
in the tunnel.
yes, light at the end of the tunnel. Then we have some of the fan fiction
Twirling
cliches.
the like daggers.
Yes,
and, like,
twirling the daggers or twirling the
fantasy.
hair in romance. Yes, there are lots of things that are cliches. However, I will say don't be too afraid of cliches just because, like I said, it's like a spice. It can be good in small doses. Just don't do it in entirely cliches. Your book
You
can't
don't
be
need to
all
specify
cliches.
what type of butterfly.
Exactly, you don't need to specify. It's okay. We can just maybe just give a different description. Turn cliches and twist it into your own thing. I find that's the most fun thing because then people have the familiarity of the cliche, but then you totally made it your own thing and they're like, ooh.
Like, I saw a song that was like butterflies like floated through her mind, taking away her thoughts.
Ooh, see, there you go. It
And-
takes the cliche and it made it her own.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I was like, that's an interesting way to do
That's
that.
a fun one. Yes, exactly.
Much
And
better
so-
than butterflies in my stomach.
Exactly. And so with cliches, I would say either use them sparingly or twist them and make them your own. Don't just dump cliches. And especially don't please use the fan fiction cliches like his eyes are like luminescent orbs.
Oh, like
Yes.
orbs.
And it's like, nope, they're eyes. They're eyes. Unless they are bouncy balls in his head, they're not orbs.
Unless they're literally round stones.
Yep, unless we're talking about a statue.
Yeah.
Yeah, no thanks.
No.
Yeah, so they're And again, fan fiction can actually be really good. There are some fan fictions out there that are like so high quality they get published and turned into novels. However, that's not normally the case just because fan fiction tends to be a burgeoning author thing, which means that unfortunately you're so new to it, run into a lot of problems. But that's okay, because that's normal. I had a lot of problems. I read a lot of my old stuff and go, cringe! So, it's normal. It's normal. If you read your old stuff,
I don't think you're doing it right.
I don't think you're doing it right. You have to progress enough that you look at your old writing and you go, and have a little moment. But that's okay. That doesn't, I will say, don't delete your stuff. If you cringe at your old stuff, don't delete it. Why? Because then you can see how much progress you've made. Then you can see your progress. I know it hurts, but just consider yourself like an artist. All artists started out doing stick figures more than likely when they were 2. But does that mean they're a bad artist? No, it just means they needed time. Yes.
You asked me to send you that
Yes.
story that I wrote in 7th grade, so I sent it to you, and then I had it in a different document because I can't send it from the school.
Oh, gotcha.
And I started editing it.
God. Yes, oh my gosh, I've definitely done that. So if you want to edit your old work, that is totally fine, but don't delete it. Don't delete it because it's ultimately, it's old you. And old you still is important because you had to progress to get here. Sorry, my nose is itching like crazy. Allergies. But you had to progress to get where you are today, and you guys have all progressed a lot. Like, I honestly, you guys, when you were first here, most of you, some of you are obviously newer, but those of you who have been here a long time, I've edited a lot of your stories, and you've progressed a lot. You've done a lot better. So don't be ashamed of who you were. Just be proud of who you are now and say, yes, that person helped build who I am today. So.
I'm still gonna be a little.
You're giving Gold One way too much credit.
I don't think so. Okay.
I don't like Gold One.
So, do we have any questions about getting rejected or traditional publishing or things like that? Technically, I'm over time, but I am okay with that. No traditional publishing or manuscript questions? Okay, cool. All right.